My name is Amy Elias, and I'm the director of the UT Humanities Center. And we are really pleased to welcome you today to our distinguished lecture series. We have a terrific guest for you, Marisa Parham, and I hope that you enjoy this series and that you join us for all of our great lectures at the Humanities Center this spring. The next person who's coming in this particular series will be coming in on March 22nd, and that's Pamela Gilbert, who's Albert Brick Professor of English at the University of Florida, and she's going to be talking about tattoos in Victorian England. So feel free to join us for that one as well. It's my distinct pleasure today to introduce our special guest, Marisa Parham. She is currently visiting professor of English at the University of Maryland, where she serves as the director for the African American Digital Humanities Initiative. And she's got a number of hats that she wears. She's also the associate director for the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities and co-directs the Immersive Realities Lab for the Humanities, which is an independent work group for the digital and experimental humanities. Professor Parham received a Master of Arts, Master of Philosophy, and Doctor of Philosophy in English and Comparative Literature from Columbia University, and a Bachelor of Arts with distinction in Political Science and English Literature from Washington University in St. Louis. Her current teaching and research projects focus on texts and technologies that problematize assumptions about time, space, and bodily materiality. She is particularly interested in how such terms share a history of increasing complexity in text produced by African Americans, and how they offer ways of thinking about intersectional approaches to digital humanities and technology studies. Her recent work includes a number of things that we're going to hear about today, which is really exciting. And she's currently developing a project called Black Haunts in the Anthropocene, a book-length interactive project that focuses on memory, haunting, digitality, and Black environmental experience. Would you join me in welcoming Marisa Parham?
Thank you so much for that. And thank you all for having me here today. I think it's always, just very exciting to get the opportunity to actually talk about what we do. I'm in a really fortunate place here at Maryland, where I really get to work with people on their digital projects. But one thing I've discovered recently, well, not really recently, I think over time, that is very difficult. I think I was thinking of a conversation this morning. It can be quite difficult to get people sort of in a place where they're very comfortable talking about digital work. And so I'm going to try and give a few examples today of what those conversations can look like. This is a sort of hybrid presentation on my part, which is simply to say that I do a sort of combination of reading and talking, and it's intentional. It's because I feel very strongly that if we're going to be here together, the purpose of being here, I always say, is to actually be here together. So, we're sort of between the place of something slightly more, something a little bit more formal, of course, but also something that won't feel hopefully like I'm just sending you a recording, because then I would have just sent you a recording and not taking a chance with the, I don't know, we're still there, but what can sometimes feel like the low key terror of Zoom. Also, I was giving Dr. Elias sort of a warning. I think like many of us, my Zoom has just over time become really tired. And so sometimes it just sort of conks out. So, I have multiple contingencies in play. But if for some reason I just sort of freeze or stall for a moment, because I do have to do a lot of screen sharing, then just bear with me and I will get it all restarted. But because I said all those things, I have to also hope that we'll be okay. So the projects that I'll be talking about today are also digital projects that are available online. And I'm thinking the easiest thing to give you probably is my sort of link tree. And yes, I have like a slide that says my name and such, but I don't know, on Zoom, it doesn't quite work as well for me. But in the chat, I'm popping I can't talk and type at the same time, so fail. But in the chat, I'm just putting in a little link, and this link will sort of like, like call the trunk for the tree. So this is trunk link that takes you to where all these projects actually live online. So if I'm showing something and because of zoominess, sort of it's not coming through clearly to you and you want to be able to sort of follow along or see what I'm talking about, please feel free just to use those links. And again, throughout I'll be screen sharing, but that's just my, just in case. It's hard to know what things look like on your end, but on my end, they're looking great. And again, I'm happy you're here. So I'll be talking today a little bit about some projects I've been working on, which I was sort of framed sort of vaguely, but it's intentional because on any given day, it helps me to sort of know where I am in thinking about this. And I'm thinking about sort of the question that came up for me last week in a conversation with the sort of architect Michelle Chang, an architect, at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And we were having a conversation about a lot of things. It was a group of graduate students, and we were thinking about questions of, how on the one hand, when we're in Zoom space, like the space we're in all right now, especially if we were here sort of in the sort of audience version of this, how on the one hand, this feels disconnected, right? We'll say like, I'm at my house, you're wherever you are, etc. Right? At the same time, it's strangely also overly sort of personal, right? I was reading an article recently, you might have seen it, about sort of Zoom fatigue, right? And a lot of that came down to the ways in which sort of eye contact works differently in Zoom. And so on the one hand, you have sort of like the literal sort of distance, but on the other hand, you're also in this situation where you're too close. And so we were thinking about that, and where we sort of landed in that conversation was thinking about the question of vulnerability and thinking about the classroom as a space, the talk as a space, the seminar or lecture as a space. For her as an architect, thinking about physical and material spaces, and for me, thinking about digital spaces in relationship to what even this pandemic moment has taught us, how to think differently about vulnerability and all the things we're vulnerable to right now. I'm vulnerable to my cat, to my child who might be too loud, all these things, and what it means for thinking about ourselves as scholars. So the projects I'll be talking about today, mainly a project, a digital interactive long form project called Breakdance. And then there's a corollary to Breakdance, which is sort of process piece that goes with it, called Making, Breaking, Dancing in the Machine, or some combination of those words. And thinking about how that project was very much, centered on matters of vulnerability, and thinking about what it means to, on the one hand, want to be able to be vulnerable so that I can sort of do the sort of effective work that I want to do alongside certain kinds of scholarship. But at the same time, either by virtue of just sort of being a sort of, trained in a sort of old fashioned, for me, fine and good way as a scholar, and also around matters even of like personal privacy, right? So on the one hand, we get sort of, contemporary debates. We'll hear this a lot, I think, right now around sort of the feeling of distance in scholarship, and the feeling of scholarship, not always being, the proper vehicle for really expanding sort of the interiority of research. At the same time, I have to say, for me, and I situate myself particularly as a Black woman, there's a way in which a certain insistence on interiority and intimacy can also be quite problematic, right? So I'm hearing, and you should hear rather than what I'm saying, somewhat of a contradiction, right? On the one hand, I'm saying I want to be able to produce scholarship that produces a greater sense of interiority, scholarship that produces a greater sense of, intimacy with ideas. But on the other hand, I'm also saying, but whoa, I don't want, people too close. And so for me, people I don't know too close, right? That's the hard thing of scholarship, like anything, like any art or any practice, you put it out there. So for me, breakdance and making breaking were very much projects through which I was trying to think about this idea of how we amplify feelings and senses of what lies underneath scholarship, right? The place of scholarly feeling. A way of thinking about this, I often say, is that moment where, like, you spend your years working on your monograph or working on your article, and then at some point, the balance of like stuff that got cut out is far higher than what actually ended up in the project, right? And so I'm really interested through all of this in thinking about how we account for what gets left out of our scholarly work, because often what ends up getting pulled out of scholarly work, and that's what I'm getting at about when I'm saying sort of interiority and undersides, what gets pulled out of scholarly work to me is very often what's most interesting about it. I can think for most projects I've produced, the sort of nugget that got me started is exactly what doesn't make it onto the page. At the same time, when I'm thinking about the possibilities of different kinds of digital affordance, it's also a way of thinking about how that which would normally have to be excluded, we can in fact include. Because on the one hand, we know that through the history of scholarly editing, that the purpose of editing, or sorry, trying to make it fancy, there's no reason. The purpose of editing is to make sure you have the strongest project possible. But we also know underlying that sort of decision making around strongest project possible is also an argument around affordance, which is simply to say, we all know at that point when you're producing a book, at some point, someone's going to say, how many pages is this going to be? How many images do you expect to include? How are you planning on paying for that? And also, how do we justify using this many of pages for your argument? So on the one hand, we have editorial work as that which of course improves scholarship, but we have to also understand how it becomes over time an extension of different kinds of economic concerns. Digital ideally offers us a different kind of affordance where we can actually include more. How to do it well, how to do it properly, how to, et cetera, is its own set of questions. But just for the sake of argument, so I can move on, I'm going to say that what I'm trying to work with is the extent to which I can indeed do more. So what does more look like? What does more look like in terms of thinking about excess? What does more look like in terms of thinking about, again, what lies underneath scholarship? And in this, thinking as well about the thoughts behind thoughts, right? For me, very often, again, the real place, the deep place of engagement, the engagement of ideas is that which went unsaid. What would it mean to produce a form that enables us to foreground that which goes unsaid? This is also for me very much a hybrid space, as I've already tried to articulate, situated somewhat between the public, right? So text, classroom circulation, and the private, that which activates meaning for me in relationship to personal context. So for me, the form of breakdance is a form, the project breakdance is a form that enables me to think about the undersides of things. So let's go ahead and try our first screen share. This is going to be the opening of the project. One other thing I should say, or rather not the opening of the project, the beginning of the essay, it opens actually quite differently. So I should not say that because it actually just opens with instructions and that sort of thing. But one thing I should say here also is that part of what I was looking at, if we go back to affordance, was trying to think about how I'm trying to want to be catty because I don't mean it's a catty point. But at some point when you're working on paper, you're just kind of constrained by the size of paper. It's that simple, right? And so thinking about digital affordance in terms of how we, on the one hand, muster sort of some resemblance when we want it or some resonance with what we imagine the word on the page looks like in relation to transmitting meaning. But on the other hand, trying to somewhat also break the page. Part of the break of breakdance is the breaking of the page itself. That was a very long way of simply saying that across the project, there are pages that work on vertical scroll, what we're used to. We read down the page. There are pages that are flip pages, which gets us back to thinking about the codex. That's itself a kind of material form. And then there are many, many pages where we actually scroll left to right. So I'm asking people to move across the page in different directions, and also thinking about how even those movements in different directions signify and actually work differently as well. So that said, I'm going to attempt a screen share. Because my computer's been a little bit touchy, I should also note that a lot of the sort of underlying affective work of breakdance actually happens through excuse me, a lot of that work actually happens through sound. But I think I'm going to go ahead, because I just tried just now and my computer slowed down a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and leave the sound out, if that makes sense. So let's try this now. And you'll only be seeing the browser screen. So this is a page that is, I haven't started yet, I'll start in a sec. This is going to be a page that's an example also of how Breakdance manages users, readers, through time. So the part of the underlying theory of this is that on the one hand, it's so easy to think about digital experience in terms of space. Hyperlink, you go from place to place, you can configure and link a lot of different things together, right? I like to make the argument in Breakdance that we also want to be thinking about time. And so one of the ways that Breakdance sort of holds things closely while also expressing them is by being cued to what we think of as average reading times, which is, that was the best we could sort of do. So that's simply to say that things will be appearing on the page sort of according to the speed at which we imagine someone would be reading the page. So if you're looking at it from the beginning, thinking about a page where it's giving you time to read across sort of each page. You'll see here on the sort of left side that it's a little bit compressed awkwardly. That's simply because I made the screen a little bit bigger so you can see it on the screen share. So maybe I should put it back down again, and hopefully you guys can see that okay. It's hard to live this audience-free lifestyle, but hopefully that is visible to you. And I'm going to keep talking while we look at this. So the page is going to begin changing over time, and it's somewhat slow. You'll see on the page, however, that as things change, there's also, as much as possible, playing with the very notion of what a technology of reading might look like. That's a way of saying, in this case, for instance, that, for instance, if you're looking over here on sort of the left side of the page, here, these paragraphs will actually begin to change over time. So the page across begins to change as more information comes in, but the paragraphs themselves over time will also begin changing. And part of what I'm asking people to think about in this is always sort of the notion that what constitutes, again, the text itself is really about a series of editorial changes that meet some kind of need. Very often, however, particularly around citation, we can imagine very different ways of saying, of course, the exact same thing, particularly when we're trying to organize, as I framed this page, an organization of voices. I'm really thinking about what are the very different conversations I can pull together in order to arrive at this point. But sometimes I feel that the choice that I've made, if I use Narissa Phillip, if I use Ralph Ellison, if I use a different kind of point, that I could have used anyone else. So with this affordance, I actually get to sub those in. So it's very interesting also to sort of watch the process through which editorial work happens on my part. So what I'm trying to foreground in that very much is how, not that I don't know what I want to say, but simply that even the act of saying, right, is itself constantly contingent. And again, how do I let that sense of contingency emerge? So the concepts I've been thinking about again in this is the sort of balance between showing and telling. I need, from my subject position, to be able to show all kinds of things if I am indeed working with an expectation of making certain kinds of points, of transforming the world out of what I see as my insight or the insight of people with whom I live and work in my communities. At the same time, the requirement that I show politically gets problematic very quickly. I want a way, or rather, the idea rather that it's not showing, let me rephrase that, I'm sorry, right? So not that the political problem lies in showing, but that my sense of showing is very much attached to my sense of giving forth, and that giving forth is a choice. This is quite different than telling, right? Which is the notion or the sense that somehow I'm being called into account, right? In terms of affect, the feeling for me between being called into account and being able to show what I want to show, the gap between those is large and deep, right? And so again, in this, trying to think about what it means to be able to show when I don't want to tell, even as I also understand, of course, the value of telling. So one quick note I always also add about breakdance, about all of my digital projects is that because they're time-based, of course, there's always a problem of when is it ending? When are we gonna know when it's come to the end? And just a side note, because I mentioned to someone else the other day, the titles simply change colors. And if you were to actually click the titles, it actually takes you to the citation page, which someone recently referred to as a hidden page. But I'm like, it's not hidden if you were to click the titles, but this is the back door into the project. So this is where you will actually find all of the citations for both breakdance and for the Making Breaking project. And as well on these citation pages, you're able as well to go into the archive page, which also gives it to you sort of broken down in this very sort of very clear and straightforward way. And I emphasize this because despite everything I've been saying about showing and telling what is possible and showing and telling and etc., this is still an academic project. So it's cited not only on the level of voices that are included in the project citation, but also right now we've been going through the project, I've been going through the project and actually changing the citations, not changing citations, increasing the citation amount because I've decided to add design citations as well. I think when we're thinking about the sort of the history, particularly of electronic literature, which is a sort of subfield to which this project is also attached, it's important to realize that I'm not just looking at ideas and expression of ideas linguistically or through argumentation, but rather the argumentation is also on the level of design, and those designs have genealogies, so those as well need to be shown. But in thinking about the notion of disclosure, I also have pages throughout where I'm trying to highlight as much as possible the different modalities, going back to my previous point, the different modalities through which one might make a point in the ways in which it would land differently. So on this page, I'm thinking a lot about the difference between that which gets expressed in what we think of as straight writing. So intentionally in a lot of pages, particularly the Making Breaking project, pages look like scholarship. You know, that's kind of the joke of early digital humanities is still probably true, where your digital essay is just your paper essay in a PDF online, right? So trying as much as possible to reproduce that form as a commentary also on that form, but also thinking about what it means to break that form. So on the page you're looking at now, this is a page where I move from sort of straight writing, then I move into my notes app on my phone, which is actually where I do the vast majority of all my writing is actually on my phone. And then the moment where I have to come out of that, and I indeed realize that to get at this, I need to actually start handwriting. And I think we all have those moments going back to the shifting positionality of our own ideas, where we find that certain ideas won't even properly express themselves in medium. There are times when to get an idea started, I still need to handwrite. I'm not convinced that cognitively I'm necessarily saying anything different, but I feel differently about it. So thinking also through breakdance about the forms through which scholarship itself comes into being and how I can best describe that as well. So you might hear some resonance in this as well, hopefully with what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney have referred to as thinking about the undercommons. And I think that the undercommons is a particularly useful sort of paradigm for thinking about this, because the notion of the undercommons helps us think about different kinds of cultural intellectual formations that are attached to familiar institutions, but that nonetheless draw those energies in unexpected ways, right? So if I'm thinking about, and so this is a way of thinking, for instance, always about social media, right? One can make the argument that social media epitomizes the most corporate version of what it means to participate in the commons, in the public commons. It's controlled by private corporations who make the rules. Our data is being sold and resold on the back end, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, we know that what emerges from that work on the platforms does all kinds of work that probably works against the platform itself, right? And so we have tied to this what we can think of very clearly as, in general, sort of the history of Black expression itself, Black American expression or Black diasporic expression, where we're always looking for ways through various kinds of cultural production to break affordance, right? How do you find the thing you need and how do you make it work according to what you need. In other talks and other pieces of writing, I talk about this a little bit in one of the essays you'll find on the link tree, Sample Signal Strobe, in which I make the argument that, well, I think absolutely we can make the argument that Black Twitter existed before Twitter. And so what Black Twitter brings to Twitter is a feeling of an undercommon that is simply using the platform because that is what is there. And on one hand, that feels, very coy and fun to say. I stand by it as a fun thing. At the same time, we also understand when we think about, for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement, the ways in which this undercommon can absolutely suddenly emerge as a larger phenomenon. And so thinking as well about, again, the distinction throughout these projects between showing versus telling, showing which gets a certain kind of political work done around affect and intimacy versus telling, which is about requiring a thing of me that I may not in fact want to give you. How, again, do I use this affordance as a way to, how do I use this affordance rather as a way to emphasize this? So let me stop sharing for a moment and let's hope that my computer comes back. There. So if you can't hear me, just give me a little ping in the chat, but hopefully I am still here. The awkward moment where I'm going to keep talking as if I am still here. Thank you. And so with this, I was going to turn also to a sort of second part of this project. So as I mentioned before, or not to a second part, but to a different element of this project. But again, if we're thinking about polysemous meaning, so if we're thinking about all the various ways in which, on the one hand, as an author, as a writer, I want control over the transmission of the meaning of the project. At the same time, I have to also understand that I want to give some of that control away. Again, a delicate balance. The irony I've discovered in this is that in many ways, interactive projects enable me to sort of have it both ways. And this was something I did not expect until I started working on this particular set of projects, the breakdance projects. And this will be carried over also to the Black Haints, Black Haunts Anthropocene project, which is that in giving my readers and users an opportunity to interact with the project. So interaction, they do things and things happen. It's important to point this out about all of these projects. I'm giving you sort of the like autoplay version, but when you're in the project, you can click things, you can move things. And throughout the project, it in fact asks you to make different choices. Throughout the project, in fact, let me go back to screen share. There's a sort of way that the notion of breaking and dancing itself is operationalized. So there's a sort of page in the middle where I take the notion of breaking and dancing theoretically. We're thinking about things, about cultural formations, about responses to tragedy, responses to joy, to which one might respond a way where you're broken by it or you dance your way through it. And so throughout the project, I, as much as possible, try to give people the option of choosing to break or to dance, right? A sort of response moment is coming back to the previous page. And what's helpful about that is that it gives me, strangely, a way to, in handing over choice, limited choice to the user, I in some ways am allowed as a figure in the text to step back because the user is actually taking over the project to work on their own behalf. And so it gives me a space, if we're going back to showing and telling, where the act of showing is somewhat in the hands of the user, which for me mitigates some of the feeling of disclosure. It made me more comfortable saying more. There's also a just sort of shameless part of all this of understanding that technically, of the tens of thousands of words that actually make up breakdance, that most people won't get to most pages because you actually can only get to certain points by hovering in certain places, clicking in certain places, or combinations of clicks. This is the computational sort of underpinning of it, right? It's a sort of knowing that, unless someone tried very hard, and why would they, no one ever actually sees everything. Right. So again, there's a way in which, on the one hand, you would think that user interaction, increasing user interaction, would take power or a feeling of control, the locus of control away from the writer, when in fact it actually kind of does for me the opposite. It actually further enables a sense of a sense of process. And so for the page that I'm showing you now, this is another example where a user can choose to break or to dance. If they choose break, they're actually going to go in one direction, which is to a poem. If they choose dance, they're going to go yet to another place, which was probably the worst frame sentence I've ever actually used. It's like you will go one place or you will go another. But as an example, if you go to dance, it takes you backwards, um, sort of somewhat underneath the text. If you were to go back as well, so here's an example where if you choose dance, you go in one direction. And this is going to be a sort of animation. If you go back to the notion of editing and what goes unsaid, of a scene from the prologue of that was a strange slip, of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Um, and so what I'm doing here is through the animation of the text, mimicking a style of reading that becomes interpretive. Let me say that again. If you imagine taking a quote, right? And in that quote, the moment of sharing the quote, you're showing something to the reader. Here's a quote. I'm putting it in front of you. I'm also going to read it. We're going to read it together. In this modality, through the use of animation and timers, I'm able instead to emphasize what about the quote, in fact, stands out to me, right? So it almost becomes a form of reverse highlighting. Through moving through the quote differently, I'm able to guide how the reader interacts with the quote, which to me becomes part of the interpretive work of representation. Invisibility, let me explain, gives one a slightly different sense of time I'm reading. You're never quite on the beat. Sometimes you're ahead and sometimes behind. Instead of the swift and imperceptible flowing of time, you're aware of its nodes, those points where time stands still or from which it leaps ahead. And you slip into the breaks and look around. That's what you hear vaguely in Lewis's music, in Louis' music, right? So this notion of slipping into the breaks and looking around was the original sort of use of break in this project. Later on, as the subject matter became more and more serious as I worked on it, I realized that the breaking wasn't just about what comes in the break or out of the break, but also thinking about how the break itself is that which can break you. And so the manipulation of time itself, staying a little bit off the beat, the syncopation, the break dancing, right, becomes a way to sort of move the self around a node or nodality that would otherwise be overwhelming. So if one were, for instance, um, to choose dance, I won't do this for the entire project, you go to yet another place. But one interesting sort of side effect of this as well is that on every page, I've also introduced as a concept and then also as a practice the tendwa. So the tendwa is, in this case, a Congolese formation that uses a sort of cosmogram. So this is the circle with the circles in it. I'm reloading the page. That you see throughout the project. And the idea was that if we're thinking about breaking and dancing, not only as modalities of response, but also nodalities, again, of the relationship to time. Are you break dancing through the time or moving in a flow and a smooth flow through time? Then there had to be a sort of another term that kind of, moves past both of those, that trumps both of those as much as possible. And so I use the tendwa as a way of thinking about what it means to sort of opt out of the break or the dance on some level. At the same time, the tendwa itself often might reveal things that are still more difficult. So in this case, for instance, I have a sort of contemplation about the use of the N word in the song that the animation on the previous page had been taken from for. And so there's a way in which these are things, again, that I want to make sure get said, but I'm not convinced I want on the surface of the text, right? There's a reason why we say the N word and not the word. At the same time, I need to show you what this word is doing in this song. And so the tendwa very much became the space where that becomes more possible. And again, as you're reading through the page, it enables this sort of moment of revelation. And in this case, thinking about how that moment of revelation around the use of this word in this Beyoncé song also helps us think about other texts. So this is a song, Sorry, in Lemonade I'm talking about. And the song is called Sorry from the album Lemonade, sorry. And it has this kind of amazing moment at the end where she ciphers around this term, Becky with the good hair. And it's a moment that, on the one hand, bespeaks a sort of cultural relationship. You kind of have to know what she means in order to get it. But even if you don't know what it means, you do still sort of get it, but you're not going to get all of it. Again, going back to showing and telling. So I wanted a page that could really operationalize that sort of work that the song is doing, where it encodes a set of cultural meanings into a term. It can share the term, but the question of whether you get it or not really comes down to how effectively you can read, again, the underside of the text. So the Tindwa pages throughout Making Breaking and also Breakdance tend to be pages that are otherwise submerged in the text. So the way this plays out, and this will be my last couple of little bits of show and tell as I talk, and then I think we can move, I think, to Q&A, because it's also helpful just to talk about the project and to get it sort of back into its more sort of theoretical permutations in relation to the ways in which the subject matter is presented. But I have here also, I've moved on now to Making Breaking, which is other part of the project, which uses sort of a lot of techniques you would have seen in breakdance, but it's sort of a longer essays in a lot of ways. But in this essay, I'm using sort of more classic electronic lit strategies, for instance, of the mouse over. So the idea is that as a person is moving their mouse, I don't know if you all can see my mouse or not, but as a person is moving their mouse across the page, I'm just mousing around just to show you guys, different kinds of things will actually appear. What's nice is that for the reader, ideally and very likely, those movements are arbitrary. So you're moving your mouse because you just want to get to the arrow or you want to get to whatever, but you don't realize in that moment of moving the mouse, you're actually going to hit certain triggers on the page. And those triggers on the page become super interesting because it shows, again, the ways in which other kinds of information can be embedded. And their revelation is somewhat arbitrary and random in thinking about this. So in this case, it was a Facebook post by Sean Crowley that at the moment of writing this, he just happened to post a thing. I talk about this a little bit in the Black Haunts project as well. That was exactly resonant to what I was working on. I'm really interested in all of this, and part of what I'm trying to reproduce is also the sense of digital serendipity or the digital sublime, the ways in which our digital experiences, particularly in social media, very often can be felt as expressing a mental state that you didn't necessarily even know you had, right? So the ways in which I feel a thing, then I go online and I realize other people are feeling the same thing. Or conversely, I'm online, I'm super happy, and then some terrible thing has occurred and I have to navigate that, right? Do I break or do I dance alongside that as well? But I wanted to highlight on this page as well, a sort of final sort of hidden aspect and thinking again about affordance of even what we think about as more standardized. Let me move this slowly. What we think of as more standardized forms of knowledge and how they can work together with more kinds of experimental methodologies. So here, for instance, I have a page where, or a set of pages rather, where the actual movement, this is where it's hard, we're not in person because I'm actually doing some things with my mouse, where the sort of scrolling of the mouse and the movement of the mouse helps move the page along. And it's fine if someone's looking at the page, they don't move, it'll just move slightly slower, a little bit more slowly. And I'm playing on this page, let me make it a little bit bigger, with sort of redaction, which by the way is also just a way of playing with presenting whole pieces of text. But I was really interested at this point in thinking about Lemonade in relation to Mardi Gras Indians. So if you go back, for instance, to what I had playing on my background, it was actually a scene from Lemonade earlier in my presentation tonight, and thinking about the ways in which various kinds of Indigenous and African American cultures, you know, collide and also disconnect and collide in useful ways and also dangerous ways and harmful ways, but also amazing ways as well. So here is an example of a kind of essay, and I have the sound, so there's actually a lot of sound that works here, but I have it turned off for now. But here you move through the pages by scrolling, and the scrolling itself is timed to the fade. so that it gives you ideally an increased feeling of the scroll itself is that which is actually controlling the page. I'm going to scroll a little bit more. And so for me, this became a way also of thinking about the reader on the one hand, quote, just as a reader, while again, also thinking about how as much as possible, I want the reader to be able to also involve their body, to be able to involve their own, again, sense of agency and their own sense of active participation in the project as well. So what I'm doing now is I'm scrolling and moving through the pages. If we were doing this live, I actually asked the audience to tell me where to go, which is super helpful. Like you can tell me when to break and when to click dance and or etc. And then you come to the end and we move to, you know, the final sort of movement of this project. So to summarize, what I've been trying to think about today and what I want people thinking about in relation to the breakdance projects is thinking about the various ways in which we use the affordances of the digital to uphold certain kinds of political, expressive, aesthetic, and other kinds of projects that are coming, particularly in my case, out of Black communities. So thinking about how on the one hand, we use a sort of baseline understanding of coding and decoding and encoding, what we can say, what we don't say, how we change what we say, code switching, etc., and how we in fact instrumentalize these understandings of what it means to participate in larger cultures, while at the same time, of course, drawing from a repository of other kinds of often subcultural or undercommon cultural relationships as well. How we show the things and we show the parts that make up both our identities and also our scholarship, while at the same time never feeling necessarily compelled to tell in moments when in fact we want to write simply to be able to show. Let me go ahead and just stop there.
Okay. If everyone is as overwhelmed and in wonder as I am, we might take a moment for people to load their questions in Q&A. I feel free to do that and I'll read them off to our presenter. Marisa, do you want me on the screen while you're?
That would be great. Yeah. And I'm happy to show anything or go back to anything. It's just so hard without the feedback, you know, to know where I'm going too quickly or too slowly. So at some point it's helpful, you know, just to get sort of the audience in.
Sure. Let me, oops, where are you? Hold on a second. We'll just do this, right? Here we are, right? Yeah, so as the questions are coming in, I was wondering if you could just situate this. You mentioned this afternoon the whole field of electronic literature, and this seems to me to be very part of that sort of electronic literature community and project, but also deviating from it in a kind of third generation way. Like EL has been around a long time, right? So I was wondering if we could just start there. Is how you situate your project in relation to, you know, electronic literature as it's evolved.
Sorry, at least I caught it. But thank you for that. Yeah, I think a lot about that. And I think it's difficult to answer because on the one hand, I personally have sort of benefited from electronic lit for so many years. Even I think back to being like a baby Marisa on my Commodore 64, in a way, the ways I loved so much, you know, sort of electronic novels, those early C64 electronic novels and stuff, means that probably my earliest introductions to thinking digitally probably came through at earliest versions of eLit, right? At the same time, I think, you know, it's difficult because it used to be the same and probably still is the same with digital humanities as well. There's a way in which all these sort of configurations, be artistic, scholarly, et cetera, and or scholarly, et cetera, are also communities, right? And so I'm always interested in thinking about sort of who gets to call themselves what in relation to which community. I think on the one hand, I get to do certain kinds of work and it's like, this person is here and she is here as digital humanities. But from digital humanities, what I do is actually quite different from most digital humanists. I support and I build other people's digital humanities projects, but I do these kinds of projects, right? So even the question, what I'm getting at is that even the question of definition is so difficult precisely because it's often tied to which communities are willing to engage your work. I think in many ways, that's where the sort of Black DH thing sort of arose because Black DH, Black Digital Humanities, so much ends up pulling from all these different configurations, from DH per se, out of electronic literature, out of all these places. But we're realizing, I like the sort of way you framed the sort of, third gen sort of thing, because in a way you kind of start needing a new term just to describe what that sort of picking and choosing looks like and to make sure it has a sort of conceptual frame that makes sense. So for me, I think it's incredibly important, again, to be able to emphasize relationship of work that I do, my scholarship in relation to electronic lit, the intersection of electronic lit and scholarship, right? At the same time, I also understand the ways in which those communities aren't necessarily always ready to articulate the value of those kinds of differences historically.
Great, yes, yes. Well, we have a question here for you. Thank you for this fascinating presentation. I'm working on a book project about authorship and collaboration in early African American literature, and I find your points about interaction, citation, and conversation really helping my thinking. Can you say more about how your project gives us new ways to think about authorship and or collaboration?
Yeah, I think a lot about it. One of the sort of things that was on my mind when I started working on this project are the ways that, I don't mean in a poopy way, but it's noticeable, the ways in which habits of citation, I think, are decreasing. And I have a whole take on sort of the neoliberal university and the ways in which so much depends on being a singular voice that we are increasingly sometimes losing sight about how much of scholarship, I talked about this morning, actually is coming through collaboration. Like, who are the archivists and librarians who are helping you? Who are the research assistants who are actually helping you? What are the conversations you had? So I'm a very big person, for instance, on citing conversations, right? If I was talking to you and you said a thing, I'm like, OMG, that makes me realize what I should have done in my project was this and that. How do I account for that? Right. And I think when we're thinking particularly about African American or even sort of Black diasporic production, particularly in the Americas, there's a way in which we do need languages for all the places ideas come to us from, because there are such robust habits. You see this on Twitter, such robust habits of sharing, right? But those robust habits of sharing are also producing scholarship, even if it only sparks in you like an idea. And so that idea at some point has to get named, right, as having an origin. And that origin is very often in citation. And I think it's difficult sometimes to balance that, I guess, against the sense that, part of how, for instance, if you're in a tenure track, you make your name on the tenure track by being the only person who acts. But it's very likely that's untrue, right? And so for me, when I'm thinking about particularly the work of Black literary and cultural criticism, it's vital that as much as possible, we find ways to name and include as many kinds of voices as possible, because these are explicitly traditions that usually have multiple points of origin. It's coming from music. This is the purpose of Breakdance and Lemonade. I could have actually used other albums, right? But in the moment, that was the conversation that I knew other people who also care about the things I care about were engaged in. It was a text with which they were already engaged, right? And that decision is already a kind of citation, if that makes sense. Because when you're talking about something like that Lemonade album, for some people, you're just talking about a text I just have to be using to making points. And for other people, it's actually naming my membership in a particular kind of scholarly and aesthetic community.
I could keep going, but I'm going to let somebody else ask a question. So the other question that we have here is that the person wants to ask about how your work has shifted or responded to the pandemic, which has changed agency and interactivity. I think you started to talk a little bit about that at the beginning. That's really interesting. Is breakdance a model for post-pandemic scholarship?
I don't know. I love that question. I mean, it was interesting is that the sort of stuff I was saying today, it's interesting. So the stuff I was saying today about vulnerability in relation to breakdance and making breaking has come to me recently. It wasn't really there as thematizable when I produced the projects. I produced the projects in 2019. Part of why I've been talking so much about them is that I produced them in 2019 and then 2020 happened. So I kind of, even myself kind of forgot I had published these things. I really, it was a crazy year. You know what I'm saying? So it's just kind of this weird moment, at the weird sort of lag or gap. But I do think that the pandemic moment has, forced me to think differently about even what I was looking for in that project, because it's made it far easier to thematize it. I don't think I could have as easily thematized the sort of boundary between public and private, thinking about different kinds of vulnerability in relation to scholarship, which for me were pre-pandemic concerns, but the pandemic made so apparent. I'm thinking even now, like as I'm talking, and there's like, a tiny part of me that's not religious, but it's kind of praying, because I hear like the volume of one of my children constantly rising every 3 minutes for the entire talk. And I'm like, uh-oh, we're about to hit the threshold where I have to mute and you're going to see me yelling, right? Because, I'm at home and the lid comes off at 3:30 because, no one can survive, including children, 8 hours in front of a computer in class, right? Without making some noise. And so there's a way in which my capacity personally to even be able to sort of thematize sort of those desires to completely put yourself out there because you need community, at the same time also understanding that even what counts as community in Zoom lands, I'm here talking to X number of people who I can't even see right now, right, is actually a complex configuration that in many ways reproduces the strange complexity of scholarship in the first place. You write a thing, you fare thee well thing. I hope you enjoy your time out there in the world. Let me know if you need me. Like, it's crazy, right? But it did give me the capacity to better thematize it.
Can we go back to your idea of showing versus telling for a moment? Because your project is an artistic one, right? It's a creative one. And showing versus telling is the bedrock of creative writing programs, right? That's what you're always told. But in that context, the implication for me always was that showing was telling, like that it, as you're defining it, right? Showing was making visible, but it's also a compulsion. It's what you're taught to do, right? Is that it's you're compelled to show. Whereas in your definition, it's really fascinating to me that showing and telling, showing becomes a gift, whereas telling becomes the compelled act, right? And so I wondered if you could talk about that for me for a moment, because you're really reversing a lot of, yeah, right. You're reversing the mainstay of the contemporary creative writing program in this creative writing that you're doing. So I just wanted to know if you talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, for me, it's like trying to conceptualize, I guess, the impact or pressures of the political in thinking about any act of expression, right? And for me, the breakdance projects are firmly in the place of creative work, but they are also still firmly in the place of critical scholarship, right? It's just trying to figure, that's almost what the citation site is for, where like it gets a whole separate website just for citation, right? There's a way in which that work is actually incredibly important. It's like the engine that makes it run in many ways. But in terms of reversal and the pressure where it started, it's really so. An example came to me as you were talking. So an example I can give is, for instance, Black, it's me. And there's always a sort of moment where I remember talking to a much older colleague, this is a few years ago, and I was having I work a lot as administrator, and I was having a sort of frustrating moment, and we've all had it. It's gender, it's race, it's other things where, I say a thing, crickets, someone literally says the exact same thing we all get to talk about. I'm like, okay, yes, right. Let me just stop talking before any more words come out. But, so we know those kinds of moments, right? So I was kind of having a complaint moment. This is someone I actually trust and whom, I'm actually work with and have enjoyed working with. And I said something like, it's just so hard because even if I were to even when I outright say exactly what is happening or getting people to take seriously this thing that, really matters, there's a way in which something happens in people's minds and like, they just can't hear me. And he says back to me, Marisa, I can't imagine that happening to you. I just can't imagine someone hears what you say and then, just discounts it. And I'm like, you just did it. Because I just said, right? But it was this kind of strange moment where it really brought home for me the extent to which no amount of telling is going to get through. And that's the place where it becomes really interesting. I think what what I keep calling the compulsion to tell and to give account, because the compulsion to give account is almost like it becomes, I'm overstating a little bit to make the point, but it almost becomes like that moment where someone wants to give account so that there's a site of debate. And my point simply is that we can have conversation, we can have disagreement, we can have different perspectives, but debate is something different. It's asking me to put something on the table that's my life, right? And we're going to debate if my actual characterization of my own experience is in fact correct, right? And so there's something in that sort of moment that for me was like, where's the out on this, right? Or not even the out, like where's the outside, literally. You know, I write a lot in both projects about dimensionality. And it's one thing I really like in thinking about sort of the possibilities of Black diasporic work is the sense that, you know, I can make this point for you in a poem. I can make this point for you through essay. I can make this point to you through a song, right? And how historically in Black scholarship, that sort of movement across modality is very common. That's what's really interesting, even that distinction between creative, and I'll stop, I'm digressing, but even that sort of distinction between creative and critical scholarship is a very specific historical formation attached to very specific schools of not even discipline, just schools of discipline, right? So when I think about the ways in which rightfully someone like Du Bois, W. Du Bois is lionized, you know, again, rightfully so. This is someone who is making data visualization, who's writing sci-fi. So is a Black folk is a crazy book, right? Of songs, of lyrics, of spirituals, of sociological writing, of autobiography, of all of these things. And we think of it as a scholarly text because what it does is it collects all these different facets of experience into a single critical heuristic that's about expressing something important about understanding Black life. And so I think for me, that's the place where digital work, all kinds of work can feasibly go. And we're getting more and more projects like this because there's a way in which imagining that through a straight discursive telling, and almost a social scientific or historical evidence way, is going to sort of get something done is false, to be honest, because what you in fact have to have is a frame through which those utterances can actually even be heard. And so what opens the space for hearing.
How important to you is, and you use the term undercommons, how important is, I'm thinking of Fred Wright Moten, and in the break, he talks about not opposite, but apposite, right? Apposition. And it seems so appropriate to what you're doing on the page with the way things are next to one another, right? And then speaking to one another in apposition, but also it seems fundamental to your philosophy about your art. And is that true? How important is that concept to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. There was a couple of years, I think every talk I gave probably started with a quote from In the Break and thinking about the idea of an arrangement, which is at the center. There's actually a page in Breakdance that's about an arrangement and apposition. Excuse me, and sort of thinking about, you're exactly right, what it means to put things together, and also the forces that emerge of any expression of Blackness that can also pull it apart, right? So I'm looking as I'm talking, so there's a page about halfway through Breakdance that no matter what path you'll take, there's certain pages, by the way, that no matter which path you take, you land there. So, because there's something, nodes, you know, you want to make sure that people hit. And there's a page called Born Crazy, the remix. And on that page, I'm taking up explicitly sort of, you know, Fred Moten's sort of notion. I use two pieces, one by a dear friend of mine, scholar Jeff Ferguson, and another I juxtapose with Fred Moten, which is that thinking about Moten's sense of the break, I'm reading very briefly, but the sense of Blackness as that which is both subject to, that is both subject to and the cause of the resurgence of the past into the present, right? Or into the present, rather. And then thinking also about Jeffrey Ferguson, who makes the point that, quote, engaging academic work in the Americas always requires us to remember the uncomfortable and often repeated fact that our most cherished American principles have as one of their most important sources the minds of slave masters and slave traders, right? And so for me, that's the positive tension, that even at the moment, if we're going back to showing and telling and we're juxtaposing it to someone like Lord and thinking about the question of instrumentalizing the tool through which we make expression, there's always that underlying tension. And Moten is useful because he shows us how we absolutely ride that tension We make things, we make beautiful things, but at the same time, there's a constant thrumming there that's always threatening to erupt. And so how in the course, and I try to do it with this crazy remix page, do we actually demonstrate the eruption, the moment when things do in fact break, and it's a terrible moment. And so how do we come? So after that moment where the text breaks and breakdance for the next, I think, 4 or 5, like I think the next 4 clicks or so, they're all what I call broken pages. So they're pages where the paragraphs are these chunks and you rearrange them however you want. Cause I'm like, I'm done. Good luck, y'all. You can make meaning out of this.
That's excellent. I think we're actually out of time at this point. We didn't want to keep you too much longer than an hour because it's Zoom, right? Because this is a format that doesn't allow you to stay for 2 hours and really gab without getting crazy. So that was amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. We're all going to go look at your work online now, and we're going to have a contest to see who gets through all of the pages. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for coming today. Would you join me in thanking Professor Parham for joining us? And I hope to see you again at our UTHC Distinguished Visiting Lecture Series in the future. Thank you.